A web form is one of the best ways to get input from prospective clients and indirectly establish a cordial relationship between them. The time you spend in bringing the user to your website should be complemented with the time spent in perfecting the user experience, including your web forms. So basically, forms are the introduction for any website or web application. With that, I, Bhavita, would welcome you on behalf of Edureka to this tutorial on Angular Forms. Firstly, let's take a look at the agenda for today. We're going to start off the session by quickly having a brief introduction on Angular Forms, and then look at the types of forms that exist in Angular. Next, we'll have a brief look at both reactive and template-driven forms in Angular. Next, we'll see how validation is done, and then we'll dive into the demonstration part. But before we get started, make sure you're subscribed to Edureka YouTube channel and hit the notification bell to never miss an update on the latest videos. Also, if you're interested in online training certification, do check out the link given in the description box below. With that, let's get started. So basically, handling user input with forms is the cornerstone of many common applications. Applications use forms to enable users to log in, to update a profile, to enter sensitive information, and to perform many other data entry tasks. So basically, Angular form is typically a basic HTML form with many extra features. Now, Angular form helps the user provide input events from the view itself. Now, it will also provide direct access to your form API. Now, this will happen by synchronous data flow between view and your data model. Now let's understand the importance of using forms. Now basically, I've considered Google's form here. Now as you know, Google is a prime user of forms. As you can see here, it's a sample Google usage form. So Google practically uses forms to manage event registration, create a quick optional poll, and much more. With Google Forms, you can actually create and analyze surveys right through your mobile or your web browser. Now this needs no special software required also. You basically get instant results as they come in. And you can summarize survey results in just a glance with many charts and graphs. So I can briefly tell here that form is an important aspect of any particular application. Now moving on, we'll look at the building blocks of Angular forms. So as I've already mentioned, there's something called as form control. Now basically, form control makes sure that it shows the field's conditions such as whether it's been touched, untouched, dirty, or pristine, or something like this. Next, we have something called as form group. So basically, form group is a bunch of form controls together. Now, when many of the form control features come in together, this will form a form group. Next, we have something called as form array. So form array is just like form group. It will basically act like bunch of form controller, which will aggregate the values and validate state of its child components and other things like these. Now let's look at each of them in a little more detail. Firstly, speaking of form control. Now each field's information is basically provided by form control object, like its value, whether the value is legitimate, or if not, what are the validation errors, and so on will be provided by the form control. Now next we have form group. As said earlier, it is a group of form control objects. At least one form group exists in every Angular form. And in use cases such as separating the handling of personal and professional data parts of user registration form, you may actually decide to create different form groups. With that, let's dive into the types of forms that exist in Angular. Now basically there are two types of forms in Angular: template-driven form and reactive forms. So basically both capture user input events from the view, and they validate user input. They create a form model and data model to update and provide a way to track changes. Now let's see the key differences between each of it. So basically in reactive forms, it's mostly explicit and it is created by our component class, while template-driven forms is mostly implicit and directives are being used to create it. Next, our reactive forms are mostly structured and immutable, while template forms are unstructured and mutable. Now, reactive forms are asynchronous and synchronous, but majorly it is called as synchronous because in whole it's mostly synchronized. Now, on the other hand, template-driven forms are only asynchronous. While reactive forms uses methods and functions to be created, our template-driven forms is mostly directives oriented. With that, let's look into each of it in depth. Now, firstly, we have reactive forms. So basically, reactive forms use an explicit and immutable approach in managing the state of a form. Now, this is at a certain given point of time. So if we have some special use cases and we want to control more over the form, we explicitly create control objects, and when this happens, our reactive forms comes into picture. Now here's a small example as to how we can see our reactive forms from our front end. Now reactive forms are basically more scalable than template forms also. I can also say that they are mostly model-driven approach to handling form inputs. Now let's see some of the features of reactive forms. As I've already mentioned, they are mostly explicit and immutable in their approach at a particular given point in time. Also, they change their form states because they have to maintain an integrity of model while they change each state. Now this happens when they return to their new state. So reactive forms are basically built around observable streams where form inputs and values are provided as stream of inputs which can be accessed only synchronously. With that, let's dive into the second part of the forms, which is template-driven forms. Now, as you can see, this is a sample template-driven form. Template-driven forms basically use a property called as ngForm, which is basically a directive that will convert it to the template-driven form state, and it will create a top-level form group control. Now, all this will understand in the features part. So basically, we can actually provide some of the directives in template form for us to create a HOOD which will call as form controls. Now, using these form controls, we approach a method called template-driven form. Now, with that, let's look into some of the features of template-driven forms. So basically, template-driven forms, as I mentioned, uses two-way data binding. Now this is done in order to update the data model in component as we make any changes in our template. Now you can basically build any kind of form using Angular template, which will include login forms, contact forms, and any kind of business-oriented forms. I might also add here that template-driven forms is the most preferred and the simple approached forms. But again, when testing comes into picture, template-driven forms is a lot more difficult rather than reactive forms. You can also use layouts to control creatively and bind them to the data in the object model. Now let's take a quick look at how validation is done in each of the type of forms. So what is validation according to you? Validation is something that will help our form prevention and make sure our security vulnerabilities are maintained and keep our forms away from website attacks. Applications basically use forms to enable users to log in, update, and have any particular sensitive information in order to perform many data entry tasks. In today's world, without validation of forms, otherwise all your data will be leaked and breached to the outside world. Hence, validation is a vital part of creation of forms. So make sure any form that you create, it should be validated. At least first level or entry level validation should be performed. So let's see how we can validate using template driven forms. Now this is the code structure that we use in order to validate our template driven forms. So every time the value of a form control changes, basically Angular runs the validation and it generates a list of validational errors which will tell you if the status is invalid or valid or null for that matter. Next we have validation in reactive forms. Now basically you use init function in reactive forms in order to perform our validation. With that, you can actually give your results using get. Now instead of adding validators through attributes in the template, you can actually add validator functions itself. Now this will happen directly to your form control model in your component class. Now basically when you create a component, you can call a function and then add your form controls. The next thing is Angular calls these functions whenever your value has to change or your control has to change. So form group form control is mainly used in our reactive forms. Of course, it is used in template driven forms as well. With that, let's take a look at demonstration. So here for demonstration, I've considered an editor known as Visual Studio Code. You may consider any editor as of you prefer. So firstly, to create any particular Angular application, you need to create a project. And here I've considered a project name as form validation. You may consider anything you may wish for. Now in form validation, when I create this project, I will be seeing many folders, and one of the important folders that we need to work on is the source folder. Now inside the source folder, we'll have app folder where we have all our components being created. Now inside this component, you can actually create one more component using the command ng space g space c, the component name. And once you do that, your just created component will appear over here. So I have created a component named form demo, as we are going to work on forms today. Now, once I open this component, I have a number of component files here, a TS file, a HTML file, and styling CSS file. Now with that, let's get started with our demonstration. So first thing when you create a component is you're supposed to go to app.component.html and call your just created component tag here. This is to render the component that you created into your application. Now once you did that, just for appearance purpose, I'm just going to give this command. Now I have given this only to make it visibly delight. Let's go ahead and see in our terminal what we have. I'm assuming this will not be displayed, but let's go ahead and see. First thing we're supposed to do to see our output in our browser is we need to give certain commands. Now first thing is make sure you have installed npm. So I'm just going to say npm install. Now once your npm is installed, make sure you start your browser. You can say npm start. Now once it is compiled successfully, let's go ahead and see in our browser. Now as you can see, I just gave this tag Edureka. That's what we are seeing here. Otherwise, whatever is there in our components HTML file, we see it here. Now let's go back to our Visual Studio Code and see how our component works. As I told you, whatever is displayed in our HTML, that is what is displayed in our browser. Now let's go ahead and edit this part. So before we go ahead, it's important for us to understand the use case scenario today. So the use case here is to create a login form which has fields as email ID and password. So for that, firstly, we have to import a form module. So let's go ahead into our app.module.ts and import our form module. So to import form module, now before that, just notice here our component has been imported and it is also been mentioned here in the imports. Now let's go ahead and import our form module. So I'm just going to import my form module here. Say import. You can see forms module here. Now it's imported. Also, we need to call it in our imports. Now we have imported. Now any form structure we create in our Angular can be done hassle-free. Now let's create the form. So in order to avoid all the trouble, I'm just going to take the forms from Bootstrap Forms. So let's go back to our browser. Just going to say Bootstrap Forms. Here in Forms, I'm going to copy this and paste it over here. Also, along with this, you need to go to styles.css and then paste a command, which is again given in our Bootstrap Forms page. Now I'm going to insert this import file here. Now I'm doing this because our forms should be displayed in a correct format with our CSS in a right format. So I'm just importing this file over here. You can find this URL in your Bootstrap Forms website itself. Now let's go ahead and edit our forms and remove the unwanted things that we don't want here. So the first thing that I'm going to get rid of is my small tag, which it is not necessary. I'm just going to say delete. And the next thing is this class, which is not needed. Just going to keep saving meanwhile. And again, I'm going to remove this particular class, which again, I don't need it. Just going to save again. Now I also don't need form check. Going to get rid of it. Now, as I mentioned, our use case is only email address and password. So just going to let that along with the submit button. So now I need to make sure that this is in a proper format. So I'm going to add this within a div class. Let's go ahead and do that. Just going to say div. I'm just going to call the class style and say text align and center, just to make it in the center. Also, I'm going to close this div tag, close here as well. Now save it, and let's go to our browser and see how this is displayed. Now, as you can see, our email address, password, and submit button has been displayed here. Now, let me make this also center aligned. So for that, I'm going to this, and let me give a class over here. I'm going to say same thing, text align center. Save it, go back to our browser and see. Now this is visibly delight enough. Let's go ahead and start with our technical stuffs. Now, starting with our technicality, first thing we're supposed to do is we're supposed to add ng model. Now that's going to be for all our input tags, that is to call our input. So let me just go ahead and say ng model. So I'm going to do this for all the inputs. Now we have just 2 of them. So I'm going to add ng model. Now adding this will import all the particular ng content into our forms. How are we going to know this? We'll get into our browser and then we'll have a look at it. Now, if we go back to our browser and I just inspected here. Now, once you inspect, if you click on the input tag, you can see here there is a class called ng content and some more classes of ng that's been added, which means our form is being recognized by Angular. Now let's go ahead and move on to our next part. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to start with our form method. So once you submit the form, our submit method is being called, and hence a method called form method should also be called. Now for that, we're going to add something that is related to submit. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to add ng submit. That's going to be in brackets. Now this equals our submit method should be called. I'm going to say submit. That's the submit method. Now let's define the submit method in our form.component.ts. Now opening our form demo. Now let's get rid of this unnecessary code. Now this is not necessary over here, and this as well. Just going to keep that here. Now to define a function for submit, what we're supposed to do is I'm just going to say submit, and then I'm just going to console log this so that once I enter some value, I'm just going to see this in my console and just going to save this. Now once this is done, every time I hit a submit button, this method is being called. Now let's go back to our browser and see how this works. Now coming back to our browser here, let's get into the console, clear our console, and let's hit submit. I'm saying submit and it says form submitted. So our functionality here works. Now let's go back to our editor again and work on the rest of the form part. Now for us to represent the JavaScript, we're supposed to go to our HTML file here, and we're supposed to call our login ID and say ng form. Now this is for our form representation of JavaScript. I'm going to save this. I'm going to go to component ts and I'm going to say login, and also here I'm going to call login. That is to say the form that once I log in, you need to take the submit. Now I'm just going to say there is an error shown. So I'm going to say save. Now in order to rectify this error, we're supposed to go to our HTML file and make sure you call your argument as login. As you can see, it is compiled successfully, and let's go back to our browser and see. Now, as you can see here, I'm going to say submit. Now, you can see that there are callback functions called here. Now, there is 𝐵𝐺_submit, controls, form, and here you can see controls. An object has been passed, and it says status as valid. Now, here you can see that invalid is saying false, untouched is saying true. Now, I'm going to speak about this further in our session today. Now, this is something that we have to keep in mind when we create validation for our forms. So we can make use of this feature to validate our forms over here. So let's go back to our editor and work on the further updates. So here in my editor, I'm going to add one more class for my input, saying required, as I want my email ID to be required. Just going to save this. Now, after I've done that, let's go back to my browser and check this required, how it works. Now, the first thing I'm supposed to be doing is I will be submitting it. And again, if I go back to my forms and here in my errors, now here in our browser, as you can see, I'm just going to say submit. Now after this, let's get into our form and then controls. And then in our user email, it says errors required true. Now here it means that since we have given our class as required for this email, now that means when you say class as required, it means when you give any input, it gives error, and you may need to give an input in order to proceed in your forms. And hence it says required is equal to true. Now let's go ahead and proceed with our other functionalities. Going back to the editor again. So as I've mentioned earlier in our inspect, as you saw, there were many objects as valid, invalid. Now we're going to change that and leverage with those objects. For that, we're supposed to add something called as template variable. How we add that is we're going to say /variable equal to, I'm going to say ng model. Now we're doing this because we're supposed to use those objects in order to control our form. Now we need several operations to be occurring in our form. So for that, we need to work out with our objects present there, and we need to leverage with our template variable we created here in order to control our form. So we're going to add this to input, and let's go back to the browser and see how this works. Now, before we go back to our browser, let's give our variable name as a name. And since we want it for our email, let's put this in email and not in our password, as password is a sensitive field. Now I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back to my browser. Now here in my browser, I'm going to say submit. When I say submit, I'm going to go into my ng forms. And here, as I've mentioned earlier, there is invalid. And here, let me see what is it now. Back then, as you noticed, it was false, and now invalid says true, which means adding this, we are going to use it in alerting the user about giving your input field. So this can be used as an object, and we can alert our user. So we'll see how that works. For now, this is what is being done here. Now let's go back to our editor again. Now to work around with that invalid and to alert our users about our form, we're going to create a div class under our input. So I'm going to say div. And here I'm going to give an if statement. So I'm going to say tar ng if. Now here, when a variable is touched and a variable is invalid, I have to alert the user. So I'm going to say alert danger. Now here my variable is name. So I'm going to change this to be name. So this is the div class I need to be telling the user to. And here I am going to give a message to user telling email is required. Okay. Just going to save this. But before we do this, we're supposed to add our alert class into our CSS. So I'm going to go to my CSS page and say dot alert danger, just to give it a class. I'm going to say background color as red, as that signs danger, and my alert class also, that's going to be color white. Let me have my text as white. Now I'm going to save this. Now the error shown was I have given this as a dash. Make sure you don't do such errors and just save it. It's compiled successfully. Now let's go back to our browser and see how this works. Now coming back to my browser here, if I say email and then I don't give anything and I go, it says email is required. Now let's make this a more visibly delight. Let's give it black background. We'll do that. As you can see here, if I go to password, I'm just going to refresh this again, and I say without that, I go to password, it's going to say email is required. Now let's go ahead and change this, and meanwhile we'll look into other functionalities as well. So here in my editor, I'm going to this and I'm going to change this to black because it was not visibly delight. I'm going to say black. I'm going to save this. Let's go back to our browser and check this. So let's reload it and go here. As you can see, it says email is required, and I have changed the color and hence this is changed. Let's again carry on with our next set of functionalities to finish our form validation as well. Now here in forms, you can actually use nested if as well, create our validation. So let's go ahead and do that. For that, I'm going to add one more div statement. I'm just going to say div. And let's say we have a class with minimum length for email address. Now I say there is minimum length and I give the length as 2. Just put this in bracket. Now I save this, and here I'm going to add another if statement. So my if statement is going to be ng if my variable name, which is name dot. Now I'm going to check for the errors. So I'm going to say errors, and if there are any errors, then my class, I'm going to say minimum length. So let's say this as email is invalid. Just a statement that I'm going to add here. I'm going to save this. But since we are using nested if, it's important for us to have a div class for this as well. Now, since we have included this to both these two statements, we need to put this into a nested if. So I'm going to add div over here and close this statement also in a div. That way, this can be enclosed in a bigger div. Let's give the indentation so that we'll have no confusion here. Just checking if all the divs are in place. Now, since I'm giving an if statement to email as well, let me go ahead and give this also an if statement and say it's required. I'm going to save this. Let's see if this will work. Back in my browser here, just going to refresh this. And let's see if our previous functionality works. Just not going to type anything. Go here. It says email is required. Now with that, let's go ahead and see. I'm going to say AB. It gets submitted. But if I say A, it says invalid email. So this proves that all our functionality is working. Now with this, we've reached to the end of today's session. In this session, we've learned both about forms and form validation. Now I hope today's session was helpful for you. Of course, you can try many more things that is involved in this. This was a simple application, how it works and however the forms validation is occurring. I recommend you to try more and complex applications to master this. I hope this session was helpful. Until we meet again next time, happy learning.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!